Welcome. My name is Shara Savage, a program consultant in the Office of Assessment and Accountability, or OAA. Today, we will cover the Administration Code Regulations Training 703 KAR 5080. The training has been broken down into 4 sections: Introduction, Preparation, Administration, and Completion of State Assessments. If you are providing accommodations, you will also need to review the Inclusions of Special Populations training. This training must be completed prior to administering any state-required assessment, which include KSA, Access for ELs, ACT, and others. During this section, we will cover the introduction of the Administration Code. This includes training protocols, test security, rationale, test preparation or test prep, the inclusions of special populations, and the alternate assessment. The support material that you received include the Administration Code, Kentucky's Educational Assessment Program, this PowerPoint, and the training videos. Please note the page number at the top of the PowerPoint slide or referenced within the slide throughout the presentation is where the information can be found in the regulation. So what is the rationale behind the Administration Code? Professional ethics, educational defensibility, and student ownership are the standards used in determining appropriate practices. Any state preparation practice must be done in a manner that will impact instruction and benefit student learning. Action taken by anyone involved with the test administration shall be done to benefit students' overall learning and not to solely gain a testing advantage. The assessments are designed for students to demonstrate their understanding. Inappropriate assistance can lead to invalid and unreliable test results, impacting students, parents, schools, and communities. Now let's take a look at test security. KDE employs various data forensic techniques as part of its test monitoring process. The purpose is to examine inconsistencies that could indicate wrongdoing and investigate as needed. The investigation could be used to exonerate individuals suspected or accused of misconduct. Some discoveries of inappropriate practices can be cheat sheets, adults changing answers, receiving help, or verbal cues from administrators. Each year, staff from the OAA visits schools during the testing window. The visits are announced to the District Assessment Coordinator, the DAC, shortly before the team arrives at the school building. Sites are chosen both by purposeful and random selection. OAA staff will interview school and district staff and request to see storage and testing areas. Certain documents are also collected at the time of the visit. Any situation that violates the Administration Code or the Inclusions of Special Populations regulation is reported as an allegation. Allegations are investigated by KDE staff. The investigations require documentation of the incident to be submitted and can include additional school visits and interviews with those involved. Let's take a look at appropriate instruction and test simulation practices. What is considered acceptable instructional practice? Concepts appropriate for curriculum instruction can be found in the Kentucky Academic Standards. Other regulations apply to curriculum instruction, reward funding, etc. When planning activities tied to assessment, refer to the regulations. Reviews are a part of standard instruction. Including this type of instruction during the test window is expected and should be reflected in the lesson plan. Reflection in lesson plans will serve as evidence of ongoing instruction should there be questions about the review's timing. Employment outside of the school day is a teacher's choice. Examples of outside employment may be individual student tutoring paid for by parents, ACT National Administration, Sullivan Learning Centers, etc. Please note, teachers and other staff shall not be required to conduct test preparation activities instead of regular classroom instruction and shall not be required to conduct test prep activities outside the typical workday. Please see page 13 of the Administration Code regulation. Test simulation practices are allowed under certain circumstances. Activities related to testing preparation should be planned to improve student learning, including reviewing student results, student feedback, and advanced instruction. Events for the sole purpose of raising test scores or practice with no feedback are not acceptable. Testing activities that provide feedback that can benefit students' learning are permitted and encouraged. Students should be familiar with using test-taking strategies for assessment, such as those used in the classroom, direct informative assessments, etc., not just for this use on state-required assessments. Test prep courses, whether developed by teachers, districts, or commercially bought products, are acceptable as long as the results are used to identify students' strengths and weaknesses and guide instruction. A best practice alert. Benchmark testing is acceptable. However, it should not be used to increase scores artificially. For example, it is inappropriate for the Brigance in preschool to be used repeatedly to improve readiness scores. Beginning on page 16 of the regulation, it touches on the inclusions of special populations regulation and the alternate assessment. If you provide accommodations, you will also need to be trained on the inclusions of special populations training. Annual training is essential for staff to understand their role in providing accommodations and meeting regulatory requirements. Accommodations are intended to allow students with disabilities access to the curriculum and assessments at the same level as general education students. The purpose of accommodations is not to provide an advantage or ensure proficient scores. A violation of the Administration Code does not necessarily violate the inclusions of special populations regulation. What is the alternate assessment program? The alternate assessment program is for students with the most severe cognitive disabilities. Only a student who meets all the eligible requirements for the alternate assessment program may participate. Eligible students shall be identified through the Admissions and Release Committee process. Interventions related to the alternate assessment should not diminish students' ownership, but rather aid in the students exhibiting his or her knowledge and skills. Accommodations must be on the student's IEP, 504, or PSP, and the student should be accustomed to their use. Altering student results for any reason is considered a violation. Neither students nor adults may continue working with test materials after the alternate assessment test window deadline. Is additional training required? Yes, additional training is required for those administering the alternate assessments, and other trainings can be found on the KDE webpage. This is our first check for understanding. The quizzes encompasses. This is our first check for understanding. The quiz encompasses the materials we just covered. I'll give you a few minutes to read through these yes or no questions, and then we will discuss the answers. Okay, number 1. Is it acceptable to do scrimmages or test prep activities? Yes, it is acceptable if feedback is provided to enhance student learning. Scrimmages, content review, and benchmark testing type of activities are acceptable if the results are used to guide further instruction and to identify and improve areas of student weakness. Number 2, is it acceptable to do a content review prior to testing? Yes, it is acceptable if it is a part of the ongoing instructional practice. Regular review of content as part of the ongoing year-long instructional practice is encouraged. Number 3, are site visits during testing only chosen randomly by OAA? No. OAA site visits are selected both randomly and purposefully. Preparing for the state assessment requires district and building assessment coordinators to work together to ensure that test security is maintained, required training have been conducted, the correct classroom materials are available, seating charts are started, and that student motivation and rewards do not conflict with testing, or other school policies. DACs and BACs are the authorities when dealing with state-required testing. Managing test preparation, successful test administration, and return shipping is the responsibility of the DACs and BACs. DACs or BACs shall schedule the test administration, arrange for adequate staff to administer the assessment, prepare student testing rosters and seating charts, and ensure that all assessment materials are kept secure before, during, and after the testing sessions. Test security should be the top priority throughout the testing process, from the receipt of the materials through the test administration and the return of the materials by all parties involved with creating or handling the testing materials. Secure test materials will vary slightly by assessment, but let's look at our most prevalent test, KSA, to understand secure materials better. For online testing, test tickets and seal codes created from the PAN system for TestNav, which students use to test, are considered secure materials. Once these items are printed, you must keep them secure until they are distributed on the test day. After the test ticket and seal codes have been used, they will be returned to the BAC to be securely destroyed. If you are dealing with a paper pencil test or accommodated test kits, you will have test booklets containing test questions and answer documents to secure. Sometimes the test booklet and answer documents are combined into one booklet. Scratch paper is available to students when testing online and in paper pencil testing formats. Scratch paper is considered a secure material since test questions or answers could be gleaned from these papers. Schools are permitted to print the test ticket on a single page so that the student may use the rest of the page as scratch paper. This reduces the amount of paper that must be secured. With a better understanding of what secure materials could be, let's see what the regulation says. While most state testing is online, test booklets are still used for accommodations where an online equivalent is unavailable. Let's look at what is acceptable and not acceptable practices when handling secure testing materials. Page 6 in Administration Code contains the test materials section divided into the acceptable and not acceptable columns. Test administrators need test administration manuals, Tams, in advance of testing to read and prepare for test sessions is considered an acceptable practice. Following the Tams direction and reading the scripts aloud is vitally essential for a successful standardized administration and avoiding an allegation. Scripts are updated yearly and are unique to each assessment. Reading all parts of the scripts ensures that students' test results are valid and reliable. Anyone having test booklets prior to testing without authorization from the DAC or BAC is not acceptable practice. Allegation Alert. What would be the first thing that comes to your mind if you saw someone with a test booklet before testing? You would think that they are looking at the test questions. Maybe that review session for students concentrated on the test questions. What should you do? Please contact your DAC to discuss this type of situation because it is essential for students to have valid and reliable test results. Covering test questions prior to the exam compromises those results. When not being used for a scheduled testing session, all assessment materials shall be stored in a secure location with access granted to authorized personnel only. In other words, please do not leave test materials outside of a locked storage unattended. It is not acceptable to make test booklets available to test administrators before the first scheduled day of testing or not keep them secure between test sessions. This was designed to protect teachers and test proctors or administrators from perceiving the perception of wrongdoing. Please do not handle secure test materials unless the DAC or BAC permits you to protect yourself. Handling the materials during the test administration or the check-in, check-out procedure is expected. Handling those same materials at other times should be done by the direct request of the DAC or BAC. Let's continue with more confidential test content. Okay, starting this slide in 3, 2, 1. For the KSA assessment, the Kentucky Academic Standard contains the minimum required standards for all Kentucky students should have the opportunity to learn before graduating. Kentucky Academic Standards help ensure that all students throughout Kentucky are provided with standard content, and opportunities to learn at high levels. It is expected that teachers would know and teach concepts from those standards. Another acceptable practice is the visual scanning of student responses during a test session. The test administrator may look at those student responses to see if they are being recorded in the correct location, but should not be checking, grading, or scoring student responses or looking at test content to learn or memorize secure test items. It is not acceptable to discuss, take notes, or score test items. Have you heard of the term alert paper? It refers to the student writing or drawing about suicide or abuse, etc., to him or herself or others. What should you do if you see this during a test session or after a test session? Remember, it is acceptable to visually scan a student's response booklet or computer screen when monitoring the session. As a best practice, you should contact your DAC for instructions. Also, not acceptable is showing test items to anyone not administering the test or revealing test items. This includes a verbal discussion. Allegation Alert. Discussing test items that reveal the item's content is considered an allegation if you believe a test item or passage is flawed or incorrect. Contact your BAC. Give the BAC the content area, section, test item number, and what is wrong, such as no correct answer. Notice that we never reveal the test item content. Our last not acceptable practice is using the knowledge of the test items to prepare students for the assessment. This ties back to not having the test booklets prior to the test administration and not taking notes when visually scanning the test booklets or computer screens. Our final acceptable practice deals with scratch paper. On tests where students are allowed to use scratch paper, the scratch paper is considered a secure test material and should be collected and securely destroyed after testing. Blank or graph paper may be used for scratch paper. With the advent of online testing, some schools are using test tickets printed full page for each student to use as scratch paper instead. What you choose to use as scratch paper is a local decision. Now, let's look further at handling of secure test materials. There are times when test materials leave the school for off-site testing. This may include computers, paper test booklets, etc. For materials being transported and used for home or hospital administration or off-site administration, test security must be maintained. Leaving materials with students in a home or hospital setting is unacceptable. Secure materials must always be under the guardianship of trained staff. Students utilizing paper pencil testing may be using non-standard responses, which are maintained on a flash drive until all testing is complete to ensure that responses are not lost to the return shipment of printed responses with secure test materials. After testing is complete and student responses have been prepared for return shipment, the electronic versions are to be deleted and or destroyed. Electronic student responses are temporary and not kept for review past the current test window. Each year, at least one test proctor gives the wrong materials to a student. This can occur with online testing if the student doesn't receive the correct test ticket to log into the session. As a best practice, have students review their test tickets to ensure that they have received the correct materials. Instructing students to put their names on scratch paper and retaining the paper until testing is complete are practical safety measures in case there is any need to reference it before materials are returned to the vendor. We have covered acceptable practices. Let's look at the not acceptable practices concerning secure test materials. It is unacceptable to take test materials out of a school building or district building for any reason except for approved off-site testing. Bubbling demographics or modifying materials for the alternate assessment shall be completed on school property. Allegation tip. Anyone can report an allegation. If you are seen with secure materials outside the school or district building, someone might assume that you have nefarious motives, such as changing student answers. In reality, you are leaving to do off-site testing. Work with your back on how to protect secure materials when transporting for off-site or homebound testing. If a student uses accommodated testing, which produces electronic versions of the test questions or answers, these materials must be destroyed following testing. Maintenance of these materials after the test window is an administration code violation. Lastly, students should not transport or move his or her test materials from one location to another. For example, a student receiving extended time needs to move to another room to complete the assessment. An adult who has received administration code training should transport and escort the student to the secondary location to finish. It's time for our next check for understanding. I will give you a couple minutes to read through these yes or no questions, and then we'll discuss the answer. Is it acceptable to take photos of test items for use next year to know you are teaching the correct content? No, it is not acceptable to take pictures of test items for use next year to teach the correct content. Concepts appropriate for curriculum instruction can be found in Kentucky's content standards. Test administrators may use released test items and support materials posted to the KDE website to help prepare students for assessments. Number 2, is it acceptable for testing staff to receive or access test administration manuals, Tams, prior to the first day of testing? Yes, it is acceptable for teachers to receive paper or electronic test administration manuals, Tams, prior to the first day of testing. Number 3, is it acceptable to read only the bold type of instruction in the Tams and skip the test administration directions if you have been a test administrator in previous years? No, it is not acceptable to read only the bold type of instruction in the Tams and skip the test administrator instructions for those who have been test administrators in previous years. Test manuals are updated yearly. It's time to take a look at appropriate assessment practices, such as the required training for administering the state assessment. The administration code applies to all state required pieces of the accountability system using paper or pencil, computers, or digital technology. Anyone with the potential to be involved with any component of state required testing must be trained on the administration code regulations before beginning the work. This could include, but not limited to, principals, off-grade teachers, substitutes, accommodation providers, librarians, etc. Individuals providing accommodations to special needs students must also receive training on the Inclusions of Special Populations regulation. Volunteers involved in state testing, such as providing accommodations or helping with proctoring, must meet certain stipulations that also apply to school staff. No student may administer a state assessment. This includes peer tutors. All volunteers must have administration code and Inclusions of Special Populations training and sign non-disclosure forms. The volunteers must be under the strong oversight of a certified person who will be responsible for the test administration. Suppose there should be a testing allegation involving a volunteer. In that case, the certified staff person in charge of the testing environment must be submitted on the allegation report. Schools and districts may use materials provided by the Kentucky Department of Education or locally produced. Solely reading the regulation and signing the signature page at the end of the document shall not be considered adequate training. Training shall include interaction regarding the content of the regulation with supporting examples and situations, the opportunity to ask questions, etc. The intent or meaning of interaction is for the training to be more than being assigned to and sign the document. The DAC manuals and Tams are the guiding documents for test administration procedures. Reading the Tams is expected as part of the required training. Following vendor test administration manuals is one of the most important steps. Districts are charged with maintaining records of individuals receiving administration code training. The participants' records may be maintained through collecting individual signature sheets found on the last page of the administration code regulation document or by the retention of group training attendance signatures pages. Copies of the signature page or group attendance sheet may be maintained in hard copy or electronic format. A copy of the group signature sheet is available on KDE's website. Training participants are held professionally accountable for their actions after signing either type of signature sheet. Notice that both sheets state, by signing, I acknowledge having received a copy of the administration code for the Kentucky Educational Assessment Program 703 KAR 5080 and have participated in training for this regulation. I also agreed to comply with the compliance content of the regulation and understand that I will be held professionally liable. Anyone assisting with state testing will sign a non-disclosure form. Assistance includes handling of test materials, escorting students, providing accommodations, and much more. Discussion or sharing test content details with others, even though they have been trained and are participating in test administration, is not allowed. Non-disclosure forms can be found on the Forms page in the Accountability and Assessment section of the KDE website. Resources and materials available to students during testing are dependent upon the assessment. Please check the Test Administration Manual for further guidance on what should be at a student's workstation during testing. During an assessment, test administrators shall not distribute, make available, or attach to students' workstations any information or materials that are not sent as part of the assessment materials or specified in the Test Administration Manual or a student's plan. Examples of not acceptable resource include copies of acronym sheets or sheets of paper containing a system for organizing answers, test booklets, computer tools, or other reference resources. This includes printed copies of writing rubrics. A student's IEP 504 or PSP allows the student to have additional resources not mentioned in the script. Please check with your BAC concerning accommodations. If using test booklets, blank writing or graph paper, clear or colored overlay sheets, and bookmarks free of content are allowed at the student's workstation. Some schools use a brightly colored piece of paper or a district or school supplied bookmark where testing will stop in the session. If using the online test, blank writing or graph paper are allowed at a student's workstation. Additionally, students have access to the online tool available in TestNav, such as the calculator, dictionary, contrast tool, and much more. Whether or not a dictionary or thesaurus is allowed on a test will be covered in the Test Administration Manual. Test administrators should refer to the listing of approved and unapproved materials in the TAM to determine when to provide a resource. On-demand writing is the only content area where a student is allowed to have a dictionary or thesaurus. Online testing provides an electronic dictionary and thesaurus to each student. A classroom set of dictionaries and thesauri should be available for students for paper pencil testing or as a backup for online testing. Reading, mathematics, science, or social studies content area tests do not allow the use of a dictionary or thesaurus unless clearly stated as an accommodation in a student plan. It is a local decision by school or districts on whether to allow access to non-content related materials, such as books or puzzles, after the student has turned in his or her testing materials to the test administrator. Please note that this is after the student has no testing materials at the workstation. Calculators may be used in more than one content area. Check the Tams to determine if a calculator is allowed or if this test section is a no calculator math test. Online testing will provide the student with the type of calculator needed for that test session. It is expected that the student will use the online calculator and not a handheld calculator unless the student's accommodation plan specifies a handheld calculator. Handheld calculators are used for paper, pencil, or accommodated testing, should adhere to the KDE calculator policy, which is available on the KDE website. Be familiar with the requirements of each assessment that you administer. Some test vendors have calculator policy requirements that may differ from KDE, such as the ACT. KDE recommends that schools provide calculators for each student that meets the current calculator acceptable use criteria. However, students can use their own approved calculators for paper pencil tests. Test administrators are responsible for ensuring that communication and internet capabilities are disabled during testing sessions. This also includes turning off the computer algebraic system on a calculator. See the KDE calculator policy for details. It is not acceptable for students within the same testing session to share calculators, even if a test administrator clears the programs between uses. There should be a 1-to-1 ratio of calculators to students during a test session. Allegation tip: plan ahead of time to have all the necessary related materials such as dictionaries, thesaurus, calculators, etc. needed for testing both accommodated and general education students. However, it is critical to review the test administration manual to check which materials are allowed for a test session, as the policy does differ per vendor, such as the ACT. ACT allows students to use either the online calculator or an approved handheld calculator. Internet access is necessary for computer-based testing, but constant changes in personal technology make our job of maintaining a fair and unbiased testing environment harder. Using electronic devices or other internet is unacceptable to gain a testing advantage. Online testing provides a secure browser to prevent accessing other parts of the internet, therefore not allowing a student to gain an unfair advantage during testing, except in cases where allowed, such as online testing in a secure web browser. Students should not have access to electronic devices until all testing in the building is completed to ensure the students are not communicating with others in a testing session. Smartwatches or Fitbits are not allowed since those devices can connect to the internet. Online testing can only be conducted by trained staff in person. Remote testing is not acceptable with any state testing. On-site testing is acceptable practice with online and paper testing. As a reminder, in-person online testing can only be conducted by trained staff. Please ensure that testing in the testing environment is free of content, only the student and trained staff are present, and the student does not have additional internet devices in the room. It is acceptable for test administrators to use electronic devices to contact school administrators regarding test sessions. Example, problems with materials, student illness, administration questions, breaks, etc. BACs or principals may routinely request that teachers use their personal cell phones to notify the office of a need in a classroom. However, neither the student nor test administrator shall use electronic devices such as, but not limited to, cell phones, tablets, and e-readers for personal reasons during testing sessions, except for in case of emergency. Test administrators should be communicating with building assessment coordinators or other designees for assistance with a situation in the classroom and not each other while testing is occurring. Allegation alert. A student has hidden a cell phone in the pocket of a hoodie. The student takes a picture of the test and places it on social media. This would be an example of an allegation of lack of monitoring. A student using an electronic device during testing and accessing the internet during the test administration. As a best practice, test administrators have the students power down the cell phone and put them away during the testing session. Additionally, ensure proper monitoring is conducted throughout the testing session. A few years ago, when this regulation was updated, it was decided that testing room services should be free of content during operational and field testing. Yes, this means bulletin boards and walls and surfaces. It is acceptable to place instructional materials on bulletin boards, walls, and etc. throughout the year, but when the room is used for testing, those same content materials must be removed or covered, and covered means with a covering that is not see-through or opaque. Some examples of materials are any content information or strategies for solving problems. These may be anywhere in the room: walls, ceilings, floors, and clothing. Yes, clothing. When the room wasn't required to be sanitized, some schools printed t-shirts with content on them for the students. This sounds like a great idea. I can read your back, you can read mine, but what about the poor person in front of the row? He does not have a shirt to read. He is now at a disadvantage. You could say the same thing about posters. If I was sitting next to a poster and just happened to have an answer to my test question, I had an advantage over the person across the room who was too far away to read the poster. The covering of the room content did get a bit extreme. To make sure that all students had the same resources and advantages, the posters had to go. Let's take a look at some of these materials. Motivational posters or materials without content and standard periodic tables can remain on the walls. Periodic tables? Yes. Periodic tables without additional content. It does not give you an advantage if you do not know how to read a periodic table. Materials appropriate for instruction and display may not be appropriate during testing sessions. Materials that contain content, problem-solving strategies, processes, etc. are unacceptable for display during testing sessions. Even things painted on the wall, three-dimensional sculptures, or paintings used in a lesson must be covered. It is now time for our third check for understanding. I'll give you a couple minutes to read through these yes or no questions, then we will discuss. Okay, number 1. Is it acceptable for a teacher to use his or her personal cell phone to communicate with another teacher about a testing situation in the classroom? No, it is not acceptable for a teacher to use his or her personal cell phone to communicate with another teacher about a testing situation in a classroom. Number 2. Is it acceptable to allow general education students to use a handheld calculator instead of the online calculator? No, it is not acceptable to allow students to use handheld calculators instead of online calculator, unless the online calculator is not functioning or the student has a disability requiring a handheld calculator. Number 3. Is it acceptable to leave content on the walls in the testing room when administering a field test? No, it is not acceptable to leave content visible during any state assessment, operational, or field test. Number 4, is it acceptable to allow students to read library or personal books as each student finishes and test materials are collected? Yes, it is acceptable to allow students to read library books or personal books as each student finishes and test materials are collected. This is a local decision to allow this practice or not. Let's move on to seating charts. All state required tests must have seating charts. Seating charts can be for group testing, classroom layout, or individual testing, which we often see for accommodated or makeup testing. The chart must be kept in either paper or electronic format and completed by the classroom teacher. A chart will be completed for each test session and kept on file. Sometimes the DAC or BAC will supply the teacher or test proctor with a locally created seating chart template, especially if your room arrangement is significantly different. Examples of templates created by KDE are available on the KDE website. If you want to create your own seating chart templates, certain information must be included. What information should be included on the seating chart? The test name, district or school names, the test date, room number, the content being tested, all student names, names of all testing staff in the room, and the room layout. The student names should be placed in the appropriate places on the room layout. Some indicate where the students are absent from a seat on the chart. Using the same seating chart for more than one test session is acceptable, especially if you are testing more than one section on the same day with the same students. If you have questions about a seating chart you or your school have created, check with your district assessment coordinator. Student motivations and rewards, including how to fund those efforts, can be confusing. This section will help remove some of the confusion. Good faith effort checklists may be used at any grade. The checklist expectation should be general and not include any requirement that would take away from student ownership. The checklist may consist of coming prepared for testing with paper or eraser or with their Chromebook, arriving on time, not disturbing others, using time wisely, or focusing on tests during the administration time. The checklist should not include any evaluation of student responses, such as writing 3 paragraphs or whether test answers were correct or not. No feedback can be given to a student until all testing is complete and materials are out of the hands of students and teachers. The district or school can decide how to share the good faith effort checklist results based on completed testing. Results may be shared for a grade level at a school when all testing is completed for the grade level. A school could decide to share the checklist results only after all testing for the entire school is completed, or a district may give directions on how results can be shared. With online testing, some currently used good faith effort checklists may require updates. In a paper pencil test, it is easy to visually scan student responses following the test session to see if a student did a pre-write or completed all the test questions. This may not be available for online testing. Once the student submits the test proctor cannot access student responses. Using the checklist may require the teacher to mark the list as the students are testing. When using the good faith effort checklist, remember that it is a student's work, meaning we cannot require the student to use a particular organizer, strategy, or method to complete the test. How will we fund rewards using the good faith effort checklist? Funding rewards for good faith effort checklist may come from various sources. The best source may be donations from individuals, businesses, parents, or staff to fund student incentive. Other regulations besides the Administration Code apply to curriculum instruction, reward funding, etc. When planning activities tied to assessment, refer to the appropriate regulation. Your district or school staff should be able to assist you with which regulation applies to your situation. One such regulation concerns the acceptance of donations with the school bank accounts following the Red Book rules. It is not acceptable to use local school board funds or cash rewards from school activity funds generated by students for student incentives or rewards to A. Attend school during the testing window, B. Participate in assessment activities, or C. Perform well on state required assessments. Page 14. Also, extended school services funds cannot be used for test preparation. Regarding funding, please check with your school or district financial staff, especially if you are contemplating giving cash rewards. Your district may have policies in place for acceptable rewards. Having a student retake part of an assessment because of a disciplinary issue is relatively straightforward in a paper-pencil test, but not as easy for online testing. For online testing, the proctor will need to note the appropriate content while monitoring, since they will not have access to test responses once the student submits the answers. Please contact your DAC for more information. When a student's responses to test items are reviewed and found to contain inappropriate language or drawings, the student may be instructed to answer the test questions again on a separate sheet of paper for disciplinary purposes. The original responses shall be submitted for scoring to the test contractor. The paper on which the retaken item is answered should be considered a secure material and shredding along with scratched paper. No changes may be made in the original response recorded in the student response book or online text box. Only a school administrator should be handling this type of situation. It's time for our fourth check for understanding. I will give you a couple of minutes to read through these yes or no questions. Then we'll discuss the answers. Okay, number 1. Are seating charts required for makeup testing sessions? Yes, it is required to create seating charts for all test sessions, group and individual. Number 2, is it acceptable to announce on the intercom each day the results of the good faith effort checklist? No, it is not acceptable to announce on the intercom each day the results of the good faith effort checklist. Number 3, is it acceptable to let students know that they are doing a good job on test responses? No, it is not acceptable to let students know that they are doing a good job on test responses. Number 4, is it acceptable on a good faith effort checklist to require a student to use a strategy they learned in class when answering test questions? No, it is not acceptable on a good faith effort checklist to require students to use a strategy they learned in class when answering test questions. Requiring a certain strategy interferes with student ownership. During the administration of any state assessment, it is vital to think about test security, updating seating charts, administration practices, and test materials. What does test security monitoring look like? Test sessions shall be scheduled to prevent overcrowding in the testing location. Areas accommodating large numbers of students should have adequate staff to conduct active monitoring. Testing environments such as arena testing must be adequate in size and arrangement to allow for active monitoring. An adequate number of staff are required to ensure that monitoring, circulating can be done in the room. Active monitoring at all times during a test session is the administrator's responsibility. Checking email, grading papers, etc. does not allow active monitoring. It is the responsibility of principals and district administrators to ensure that proper monitoring occurs. What is appropriate in active monitoring? Testing staff occasionally walking up and down the aisles of the classroom, staying visual at all times, and ensuring technology is not being used by students. Other vital considerations are essential to active monitoring, such as test administrators must be careful not to influence or take ownership of student responses. This may require suspending some actions that are routinely done during instruction. It is acceptable to advise all students before testing begins and at the 5-minute warning to do such things as double check their work, look for items they may have forgotten to answer, and mark answers clearly by completely filling in the circle. Test administrators should ensure that students are in the appropriate area of the test booklet and student response book at the beginning of each testing session. As part of monitoring, test administrators should ensure that students do not get off track in their work. It is not acceptable to encourage students to edit their responses by providing an evaluation of work through their tone, gesture, or phrase such as "you can do better" or "you can write more." Coaching, editing, pointing out errors or missing answers in the student's work or any test item to improve student score is unacceptable. No one at any time is to alter student answers. Doing so could lead to sanctions by the Educational Professional Standards Board. Changing student answer does not solely mean physically altering, but also means such things as leading, coaching, or giving answers. Interval or restroom breaks are at the discretion of the school or district and held between test sessions. Refreshment breaks are acceptable. However, materials must be collected, secured away from the student, and students should be monitored at all times. For example, a student is taking a stretch break. The materials need to be collected and secured. If students are standing, the view of all test materials is blocked, allowing for pictures to be made of test materials. If the school or district has approved interval or restroom break, the length of time, refreshment served, and monitoring of students must not affect testing integrity in any way. It is advised to schedule tests and to avoid conflicts with lunch. However, if a lunch break is required during testing, lunch shall be brought to the student in the testing area. Suppose there are too many students for this to be reasonably accomplished. In that case, test materials shall be secured and students shall be escorted to the lunchroom, told not to discuss the tests, sufficiently monitored to prevent discussion of the test item during the entire lunch period, and then escorted back to the testing area. We saw how to create test seating charts in the test preparation activities. Now that it's test time, what do we do with the seating charts? It's time to update your seating charts. During the assessment, it is vital that seating charts that you created during your assessment preparation be updated with current testing information. The seating chart will need to be kept on file in case it is required later if questions arise. During the administration of state assessments, it is important to consider best practices on timing, accommodations, testing order, testing materials, and student behavior. Let's look closely at what the regulation says about best practices. Following testing times are essential for reliable testing administration. Students who have missed or leave a test session due to reasonable circumstance, such as illness, doctor appointments, family emergency, may pick up the next item and use the remaining time allotted during a makeup session. Test administrators should note that the balance of time remaining for the student leaving during a testing session. The student cannot return to previously answered items. Students who leave a test session for unwarranted circumstances, such as not returning after a restroom break, may not complete the test part being administered at the time he or she left. Student absences must be excused for valid reasons. Such absences caused by student illness, injury, or severe family personal circumstances to participate in makeup testing. Principals should determine whether or not the absence is legitimate. KDE recommends that students test with their peers following an absence. Makeup sessions should be done for the missed test parts as soon as possible. For legitimate absences, students are allowed to pick up the first unanswered item and be allowed the balance of allotted time to complete the test session. Students should not work on any item that were already completed prior to their absence. All testing sessions end at the end of the school day. When scheduling test sessions, ensure that the student has adequate time to finish the session or do not begin a test session. Principals should work with BACS, Director of Special Education, teachers, and accommodations providers to ensure everyone understands how to provide accommodations. The routine delivery of instructional services is another way of saying what regularly happens in the classroom. For example, if a student has not used text-to-speech throughout the school year, testing time should not be the first attempt at using it. Accommodations are to give students access, not an advantage. They also should not give an advantage or disadvantage to other students. Scribing for a student would be an example of an accommodation that could interfere with the administration of the assessment to other students. In a scribing situation, a student will be giving his or her answers orally, and other students could overhear. Students who receive extended time as part of a service plan are allowed to test with peers who do not receive ample time during the regularly timed session. To use their extended time, those students must move to another location and begin the extended time portion of their test session immediately. The amount of extended time allowed should be in accordance with the IEP 504 plan or PSP. The Admissions and Release Committee determines if it is time and a half, or double time. Where appropriate, assistive technology should be considered for use during instruction so that it may be available during testing. Assistive technology lowers the numbers of humans needed to provide accommodation. However, if a shortage of personnel occurs, the test schedule can be altered to meet student needs. Changing the testing schedule due to a shortage of personnel for providing accommodation does not mean changing the order of the test. All elementary schedules within the district can be different. For example, one fourth grade can have a different schedule from the fourth grade down the road. All fourth grades within the same school must have the same testing schedule. The district testing window is the same for each grade level, elementary, middle, and high school. The only situation where it is acceptable to change the testing order is when a student needs to make up a test session. Allegation Alert. On Monday morning of the first day of testing, you receive your test tickets and seal code folder. The folder only contains reading. However, from reading the TAM, you realize that the Quality of School Climate and Safety Survey is to be given first. You call the BAC, who states to go ahead and test with reading while the test tickets are printed for the survey. This would be considered an allegation of altering the order in which they appear in the TAM and test booklets. As a best practice, check the folder immediately for the correct materials and delay the start of testing if you find you have the wrong materials. If the schedule must be changed for staffing reasons, the test sections must still be administered in the order in which they appear in the test booklet. Rulers may be kept after testing for future instruction. DACs and BACs should ensure that test administrators distribute the rulers provided with the current testing materials and do not use materials from a previous year's administration. The rulers and reference sheets are yours to keep following testing. Please do not modify the rulers by trimming off the end so that the 0 is now the end of the ruler. Learning to read and use the ruler properly is part of the test. Alternate assessment manuals contains specific directions for altering, modifying, and working with alternate materials. With online testing, students should only use the tools provided in the online platform unless they have been approved for accommodations. Test administrators do not have to wait for an incident to happen during testing to arrange for a student in a different location from his or her peers. This is considered a local arrangement. An IEP, 504, or PSP is not required for this adjustment. It is essential to secure testing materials before, during, and after state assessments. What does the regulation say about reporting test material concerns? Errors or expected errors in test materials should be reported to KDE. The errors may be noticed while monitoring, scanning for good faith effort, or reported by students. It is acceptable for test administrators to read an item reported by a student to understand what should be communicated to KDE. At no time should secure information be communicated through unsecure means. Neither an email nor texting is considered secure. If discussion pertaining to secure information is required, appropriate school or district staff are to be notified to arrange for a personal meeting. Only non-secure identifying information should be shared in writing with the appropriate school or district staff. The information shared can be with BACs first for them to forward to the DAC, or the information can be sent directly to KDE. Any written information should be an essential non-secure item identifying information. For example, KSA, grade 7, form 3, math, item 26 does not have the correct answer choice. Teachers should not discuss items with colleagues during or after the test sessions. Reported problems or concerns must be relayed to the appropriate school or district staff. It is time for our 5th check for understanding. I'll give you a couple minutes to read through these questions. Then we will discuss the answers. Okay, number 1. Is it acceptable to indicate to the student the appropriate work area in a test booklet or student response booklet after a testing session has begun? Yes, it is acceptable to indicate to the student the appropriate work area in a test booklet or student response booklet after a testing session has begun. Report the incident to the building assessment coordinator, who will then provide further details. Number 2, is it acceptable to point out to a student that he or she probably hasn't written enough for a constructive response? No, it is not acceptable to point out to a student that he or she probably hasn't written enough for an extended response. It is not acceptable to encourage students to edit their responses by providing evaluation of student work. Number 3, is it acceptable to allow student a few more minutes beyond a stop time to finish an exam if he or she has been working diligently? No, it is not acceptable to allow a student a few more minutes beyond the stop time to finish an exam if he or she has been working diligently. It is acceptable for test administrators to observe any time limits and follow the specific directions in the provided manuals. At times, this may vary with different assessments due to a variety of reasons. However, the overall general rule is that unless otherwise stated in the TAM or training of a specific assessment, it is not acceptable to allow a student a few more minutes beyond the stop time. Which of the following are good active monitoring practices during a test session? Select all that apply. A, observing the room from all sides, and C, walking up and down the aisles. Test administrators should circulate the testing site during testing sessions. Principals and district administrators shall ensure that proper monitoring occurs. You're now in the home stretch. You've completed test preparation and finished testing. What happens now? At this point in the process, you still have secure materials. If you are a BAC, you will work with your DAC to handle the materials returned to the vendor. For some tests, you may be packing and sending from the school. Others, you may be sending those materials back to the district to be returned to the vendor in one large shipment. After testing is complete, it is time to securely destroy the Silcos, test tickets, scratch paper, and any other materials outlined in the test administration manual that should not be returned to the vendor. Some districts have these items securely destroyed by the school. Others have everything brought to the DAC. This is a local policy decision. Test booklets, answer documents, these type materials must be returned to the vendor. Additionally, please follow the procedures outlined in the administration manual if you are responsible for packing the materials and consult your DAC. Scratch paper has been accumulating throughout our testing window and should be treated as secure material. Some of the scratch paper could also be test tickets that students used for scratch paper. As your materials ship back to the vendor, it is time to securely destroy all scratch paper according to your district policy. Test tickets and answer documents should be treated as secure materials. Some of the test tickets, again, could be scratch paper if students used it for scratch paper. As your materials ship back, again, it is time to securely destroy all the test tickets according to your district policy. Completed answer documents will be returned to the vendor for scoring depending upon the assessment. You may or may not return blank answer documents. Please refer to the test administration manual for guidance on handling blank answer documents. The review of secure assessment components has shifted from the district to the Kentucky Department of Education. Let's look at how those items may be reviewed. Sometimes persons from outside of the educational environment may request to see secure materials. Schools and districts do not have to take on the responsibility of allowing access to those materials. This duty has moved to KDE. Often the requests may come after secure materials are no longer in the district. KDE keeps on file in paper format all state-required assessments. For those willing to physically come to Frankfort, KDE may arrange for specific concerns to be addressed with appropriate staff from the Office of Assessment and Accountability. Anyone reviewing a test item must sign a legally binding non-disclosure form. As much as we try to have a perfect administration, testing allegations can occur. Allegations are investigated by KDE staff. The investigations require documentation of the incident to be submitted and can include school visits and interviews with those involved. Anyone may report allegations by notifying school, district staff, or directly to KDE. Allegations can be reported anonymously through phone calls or emails. The reported information must be significant enough to warrant an investigation. Reports lacking information are stalled and cannot be followed up on with an investigation. Allegations reported to BACs should be relayed to the KDE through the District Assessment Coordinator. DACs, in turn, will submit the information to KDE online. Investigation results go to a board of review, who sends their recommendation to the Commissioner of Education, who will make the final determination. the district will receive a letter from KDE stating the actions to be taken. These are broad allegation categories or issue codes used for filing an allegation. Notice that the examples correspond to the information we have covered in the Administration Code training. A few more parts of the state assessment and accountability system are reporting student data and non-academic indicators. Non-academic information submitted to KDE is expected to be as accurate as possible at the time of submission. However, there are opportunities to correct errors discovered during the data review process. Embargoes are placed around different data types at multiple times throughout the year. The embargoes are in place to allow the review of data for accuracy before the data is released to the public. Releasing embargo data can result in shared misinformation and inadequate data used for decision making. KDE communicates embargoed time periods and when the data is available to the public. Embargoed violation could result in not having early access to future pre-release data. Non-academic data, such as graduation codes, are entered into Infinite Campus and are retrieved from there for inclusion in public reporting for assessment and accountability. Infinite Campus is considered the authority source for this data. As of November 30th, 2021, the 703 KR 5240 Accountability Administrative Procedures and Guidelines Regulation is in effect that removes extraordinary circumstances as an exemption category. Based on the findings from the federal audit, KDE may only allow medical non-participation for significant medical emergencies. It is time for our sixth and final check for understanding. I will give you a couple minutes to read through these set of questions, then we will discuss the answers. Number 1, is scratch paper considered secure materials? Yes, scratch paper is considered secure materials. Number 2, are those requests to review secure test materials required to sign a non-disclosure form? Yes, a non-disclosure form is required for anybody reviewing secure test materials. Number 3, who submits an allegation online to KDE? The DAC. The DAC is the responsible party. This concludes the Administration Code training. If you have questions, please contact us at KDE DAC information at dacinfo@education.ky.gov or give us a call at 502-564-4394. Thank you for participating in this section of the training with the Office of Assessment and Accountability.